History handed us a beautiful lie. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, dying on a golden throne with a serpent pressed to her breast. Tragic, romantic. A queen undone by love, by loss, by the cruelty of fate. That's the version that survived. That's the version painted on ceilings and staged in theatres and repeated so many times it hardened into fact. But here's what nobody asks. Why a snake? She had access to physicians. She had poison stores. She had options that would have been faster, quieter, less painful. A woman of her intelligence and resources didn't stumble into that choice. She made it deliberately. And if you want to understand why, if you want to understand what was running through her mind in that final chamber, you need to stop thinking about what she was escaping to and start thinking about what she was escaping from. Because Cleopatra didn't choose death because she was broken. She chose it because she knew exactly what came next. She had studied it, tracked it, watched it happen to other women across generations of Roman conquest. She understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent decades navigating power, precisely what Octavian had waiting for her in Rome. And that knowledge, that specific, detailed, documented knowledge of what Roman victory meant for conquered queens, is what sent her reaching for the basket. This is not the story of a woman who gave up. This is the story of a woman who knew too much. And if you want to understand what she knew, drop a comment with your city and country, because what Rome actually did after the fighting stopped is the history nobody puts in the textbooks. Let's start with what Roman victory actually looked like from the inside. Not from the general's memoirs, not from the triumphal arches commissioned to celebrate conquest. From the women who lived it, or didn't. The year is 272 AD. The city of Palmyra, in what is now Syria, is falling. And inside the palace, a queen named Zenobia is making calculations. She had ruled an empire that stretched from Egypt to Asia Minor. She had done something Rome considered genuinely obscene. She had taken territory that belonged to them, not defended a border, not resisted encroachment. She had expanded, marched her armies outward, and taken Roman land, and called herself Augusta, a title the emperors reserved for their own blood. Rome didn't just want her stopped, they wanted her made an example of. Emperor Aurelian came personally. The siege lasted months. Zenobia's forces were disciplined and committed. But discipline doesn't manufacture supplies, and eventually the walls of Palmyra gave way the way all walls eventually do, not with a single dramatic breach, but with the slow arithmetic of starvation and attrition. Zenobia ran. She loaded camels, gathered her daughters, and rode hard for the Euphrates. Persian territory lay on the other side. If she crossed, Rome couldn't touch her. She was close enough to see the water when the Roman cavalry surrounded her. They brought her back in chains. That first night in Aurelian's camp is documented, not in official records, but in the margins of accounts written by men who were there and couldn't quite leave it out. The soldiers who had fought for months against Zenobia's armies, who had watched their brothers die on her walls, were now camped outside her tent, and they were vocal about what they wanted. Aurelian's officers came to him with a request, a suggestion. She had earned this, hadn't she? They had earned this. One night. Just one. It would break her down before the triumph anyway. Aurelian refused. Not out of mercy, out of economics. A broken queen couldn't walk. And Aurelian needed her to walk. So guards were posted inside her tent, not to protect her, but to protect his investment. And through that night, Zenobia and her daughters listened to the voices outside, describing exactly what the guards were preventing, what waited in Rome, what Roman victory meant for women who had dared wear crowns. Morning came. They shaved her head first, a specific Roman humiliation reserved for captives. Then they stripped her royal garments, the silk, the purple cloth, the gold that marked her status, and replaced them with a slave's tunic. Rough fabric, nothing underneath. Then the golden chains, 60 pounds of them, thick links of actual gold draped across her body, hanging from her wrists and neck. The Romans had a particular cruelty to this detail. You wanted gold. You conquered for it. Wear it. 60 pounds meant she couldn't lift her arms, couldn't walk without help. Every step required 2 slaves holding the chains up so they wouldn't drag her to the ground. Before they marched her out, one more thing. Her son, the one who had fought alongside her, believed in the empire she was building, was brought into the tent and executed in front of her, deliberately, because Rome wanted her to understand the full accounting before the parade began. Then they marched for Rome. The journey took weeks, through summer heat, through towns and villages where word had traveled ahead of the column. Crowds gathered to see the queen who had stolen Roman territory, who had called herself Augusta, who had thought herself Rome's equal. They threw things. Rotten food. Stones. They shouted things that don't translate cleanly into modern language, but whose meaning was unmistakable. And Zenobia walked. Because stopping meant being dragged. Her daughters walked behind her, teenagers, in chains. Hearing the same crowds, the same specific promises about what Roman men did to the daughters of defeated queens. When they reached Rome, the triumph parade drew thousands. 5 hours. The chains, the crowds. Soldiers in the parade ranks, reaching through the guards to grab at her, to touch her, to describe what they'd been denied that first night in camp. Guards pushing them back, not to protect Zenobia, but to keep the spectacle intact. She had to arrive at the forum conscious and upright so Aurelian could point to her. This is what happens. This is what Rome does. Remember, this woman. And then, the cruelest detail of all, he gave her a villa, a comfortable house in Tivoli, a pension, guards, everything a former queen could want, except the one thing that mattered. She would live the rest of her life as Rome's trophy, displayed, controlled. Some sources say Aurelian forced her to marry a Roman senator, a final erasure of everything she had been. The queen who ruled the East, now belonging entirely to Rome. That was the lucky outcome. That was what happened when Rome liked you. Most queens weren't lucky. If you've been watching and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and drop your city and country in the comments below. Because the pattern we're about to trace is one of the most deliberately hidden chapters in ancient history. Go back 50 years before Zenobia to Gaul and a chieftain named Vercingetorix. He had done something remarkable, united the fractious Gallic tribes and come within a battle of defeating Julius Caesar. But within a battle isn't victory, and Caesar didn't negotiate. When Alesia fell, Vercingetorix offered himself, walked out of his fortress in full armor, surrendered his weapons at Caesar's feet, and believed what Caesar implied, that the surrender of the leader spared the people. That was the arrangement. His wife believed it too, watched him go, told herself the worst was over. Caesar's officers moved through the fortress before the day was out. They separated families immediately. Wives, daughters, sisters, categorized and distributed among the officers as payment for service rendered. The word used in the records is distributed, the same language used for grain allocations and equipment disbursements. These were not people being assigned to households as domestic servants. The Latin term used, concubina captiva, described a specific legal category, a captive concubine, property acquired through conquest with no rights and no recourse. Vercingetorix's wife became the property of a Roman commander the night her husband surrendered. She never saw him again. Wouldn't know for 6 years that he was sitting in a Roman prison, kept alive specifically to be strangled during Caesar's triumph parade, the final humiliation for a man who had nearly broken Rome. And the children. Sons were sold to gladiatorial schools or into hard labor. Daughters went to whoever paid. The family Vercingetorix surrendered himself to protect, ceased to exist within 72 hours of his surrender. Caesar documented this himself, not with shame, with the matter-of-fact tone of a logistics report. This was policy, and sometimes Rome didn't wait for victory to deploy it. Sometimes the systematic destruction of families was the opening move, a demonstration of what refusal cost. Ask what happened in Britain. A queen named Boudica had watched her husband maintain a careful arrangement with Rome, a client kingdom, autonomy in exchange for tribute and cooperation. When he died, Boudica assumed the agreement would hold. Roman soldiers arrived at her home with a different understanding. They weren't there to renegotiate, they were there to collect. The kingdom, the lands, everything. And when Boudica objected, when she made clear that this was her territory, her daughter's inheritance, that Rome had no claim, the soldiers explained the Roman position through action. They flogged her publicly, stripped her in front of her people, and beat her while the crowd was forced to watch. The message was explicit. This is what happens when you tell Rome no. Watch carefully. But that wasn't the worst of it. Her daughters, both of them, teenagers, were assaulted by the soldiers, not hidden away, not quietly. In front of their mother, in front of the assembled witnesses. This was theater. This was the message made flesh. Your daughters, your bloodline, your future. All of it belongs to us now. Refuse, and this is what refusal looks like. The historian Tacitus wrote about it specifically, recorded it with the particular discomfort of a Roman man who had seen considerable brutality, but found this worth documenting as notable. That's how far outside the norm this was, that even Tacitus paused. Boudica didn't start her rebellion because she had political ambitions. She started it because Rome had already done the unthinkable. There was nothing left to lose, nothing left to fear. Rome had already delivered its worst. She burned 3 Roman cities. Londinium, modern London, reduced to ash. 70,000 Romans dead, the most devastating defeat Rome suffered in Britain. And when the final battle turned against her and capture became inevitable, she took poison. Because she had already lived through what Roman capture meant, had watched it happen to her daughters while she was still alive and breathing and utterly unable to stop it. Death was not surrender. Death was the only exit Rome couldn't control. Cleopatra was paying attention. She had been paying attention for her entire life. She spoke 9 languages. She read everything. She understood Roman history not as distant events, but as a living manual for survival. She knew about Zenobia's golden chains and Vercingetorix's distributed family and Boudica's daughters, and what the triumph parade really meant once the crowds dispersed and the night came. She also knew something more specific, something personal. Octavian had already told her, through intermediaries and implied threats, exactly what he had planned. He wanted her for his triumph, the parade that would cement his position as Rome's supreme power. He wanted Romans to see the Queen of Egypt, the woman who had seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, walking in chains through their streets. Not just defeated, displayed, made into evidence that even beauty and seduction and the oldest kingdom on earth couldn't resist Roman authority. And the details of that display were not left to imagination. Octavian's triumph wasn't simply going to be about territorial conquest. The propaganda he had built around Cleopatra for years, the Eastern seductress, the dangerous foreign woman who used her body to manipulate Rome's greatest men, meant that her humiliation was going to be specific, sexual in its design. A public accounting for the audacity of using femininity as power. Her son Caesarion, Caesar's son, which made him a threat to Octavian's claim as Caesar's heir, would be executed. Cleopatra knew this. Octavian's people had made the math clear. The boy would die immediately upon her capture. Her other children, the twins she'd had with Antony, would live, but they would be raised as Romans, taught to deny their Egyptian blood, their mother, their history, kept alive as proof that Rome absorbed everything eventually, that nothing escaped, that even the children of defeated queens became Roman in the end. Cleopatra looked at all of this and made her calculation. The snake was in a basket of figs. The bite of an Egyptian asp causes rapid paralysis followed by unconsciousness. It is not pleasant, but it is faster than what Octavian had scheduled for her. And it was hers, her choice, her timing, her death, on her terms, in her chamber, as a pharaoh rather than as a spectacle. She died free in the only way Rome left available to her. Octavian got a corpse, and you cannot parade a corpse the same way. You cannot sexually humiliate the dead. You cannot force a dead woman to walk in golden chains while the crowd throws things and soldiers reach through the guards. The entire apparatus of Roman triumph, the machinery built to break conquered women publicly and permanently, requires a living body. She denied him that. And before you move on, if this kind of history matters to you, subscribe and drop a comment. The stories that get cut from textbooks are the ones worth understanding. Here is what gets lost in the marble and the mythology. Roman civilization was real. The law, the engineering, the political philosophy, these things happened and they mattered, and their influence is woven through everything that came after. This is not an argument that Rome was only darkness, but Rome